The Human Rights Council is suffering from a high level of politicization, selectivity in addressing country situations. About half of all special sessions and action having been taken in relation to particular countries, and it was only in later years that the European Union was successful in also putting other countries on the agenda, like Sudan in relation to Darfur.
So thank you very much for having us. I'm Rosslyn Noonan. I chair, as I say in my day job, I chair the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, and at other hours of the day I'm the ICC chairperson. And I've got with me Katerina Rose, who is the one ICC employee and our Geneva-based representative. So here we are. Our focus is on what's happening at the national level and how can the Council help us to strengthen what's happening at the national level. How can we use the Council to raise issues and therefore, you know, in a constructive way put pressure on our governments. So having made that, you know, very clear as to what our interest and perspective is, I'll now hand over to Katerina to just briefly run through for you the variety of different ways in which national institutions do currently engage and what they get out of it.
Okay, thanks a lot. And I just wanted to join Rosslyn also in saying how happy also myself and to be here and to have been able to listen to the discussions this morning. I wanted to speak a little bit about how national human rights institutions have engaged with the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms, with the special procedures and the UPR, and also to illustrate a little bit how they have used actually these mechanisms for real impact on the ground. Also the ICC as global body of the global network of the NHRs and the regional coordinating bodies of NHRs can contribute with either oral contributions or written contributions in the form of, you know, very formal UN documents which are then archived forever in the United Nations documentations. There was a major ICC side event organized in cooperation with Norway and the Office of the High Commissioner, which was chaired by the Ambassador of Norway, and we heard presentation from the High Commissioner and from the Special Representative of the Secretary General of Human Rights and Business on the role of NHRs in human rights and business. It was attended by 100 representatives from states and civil society, and was at the very timely moment just before, a few months before the major ICC conference on human rights and business. So it was also really a way of bringing the work from the NHRs and from the ICC very close to the Human Rights Council. This is an example that comes from the Uganda Human Rights Commission, which very, very actively and closely engaged with the Special Rapporteur on Health. Then it was Paul Hunt, who visited in 2005 Uganda at the invitation of the government, and also there was some preparatory work done by the Human Rights Commission to open up the space for him to come to Uganda to visit the country. This was in 2005, and Paul Hunt at the end of his visit made some very concrete and very specific recommendations as to how to improve the right to health situation in Uganda. And one of his recommendations was actually addressed directly to the Ugandan Human Rights Commission and called on the establishment of a specific health unit within the Commission with a mandate, and this health unit has subsequently been established, with a mandate to first of all strengthen the capacity of health professionals and also of the Ministry of Health on human rights approaches through training that would be provided by the Human Rights Commission. And very importantly, that unit also has a mandate to investigate, to collect data and to document progress made in the implementation of the right to health. And finally, a monitoring mandate by which, based on these findings, the unit and the Commission can engage and advise again with the government, but also with Parliament. These, the annual reports are public, are presented before Parliament and discussed before Parliament. So I think I've chosen this example because, in my view, it just illustrates so well First of all, the very important role of the special procedures can have in really having an impact, a very realistic impact, very real impact on the ground. Yeah, we're most happy to engage to provide further information and engaging the collective thinking. Thank you for that.
What, in fact, the strong advice that we received, and I received particularly from the Office of the High Commissioner's officials at the highest level, not at the level of the High Commissioner herself, but all the officials that actually make things happen there, was that national human rights institutions and the ICC should be very careful. We'd already got so much out of the establishment of the Human Rights Council, the ability to speak on every agenda item, that actually we should keep our heads down and just hope to, float through the review process without being noticed and without having anything taken off us. So that was a legitimate perspective. But, I come from a world where actually experience suggests that if you don't want to have anything taken off you, you better be pushing for a whole lot of other things so that the status quo looks like the compromise at the very least. And so that's my first point. When the ICC engages, it's not me or Katerina or even the regional chairs. We only engage on things in which we have got a mandate from the membership as a whole, and I think that's been a critical factor in our legitimacy in terms of our engagement with governments. It's important to remember the ICC is not us, it's the membership as a whole, and we are very conscious. We talk about governments being conscious of the independence of national institutions. The ICC has to respect that too. The thing most members most wanted was to be able to speak in the working group at the UPR. It was way and above more, sought after than anything else. We're not there all the time. We can't really, pass judgment on aspects of the Human Rights Council's operations. What we do know about is our experiences, our engagements, and so therefore we focus very much on those. So, they were always things that we could speak to directly with actual experience. It was really important that we showed the diversity of the ICC in this process.
With the situations in Côte d'Ivoire, where the African group actually started together with the United States a special session last December, and of course more recently in Libya and in Syria. So there I see a certain development that now some of the hardline countries in the south, and there Egypt, for instance, was a very, very strong state defending the position of the south against the north. They are now changing, so that of course is a very positive development. So if the revolutions in the Arab world, or perhaps also in other African states, would be successful, then we see a totally different scenario.
And those relationships that have been built during this period, I think, are going to be key to the ongoing developments. Not just, and this is the important thing, not just at the Human Rights Council level, but they have ramifications back at the national level. So we've already had initiatives from ambassadors asking, can the ICC support, how can the ICC help get their national institution up to an A status, etc. Very significant initiatives that you wouldn't normally get. So I do think one of the lessons is that it's building those relationships and being careful not to simply dismiss them, because we're so critical of a lot of what they're doing in some countries, but to engage respectfully but honestly with them. Initially, it was like insisting that the president should deal as directly with us as he did with any other players at the council. He always made time for us, even when he was at his most fraught and pressured. And yesterday we ended up having an hour's meeting while he explored what he thought we should be doing next, and how, including in the ASEAN region where he comes from. I find it very difficult to represent myself, but representing 67 A accredited institutions and recognising that they really are very, very significant helps you to have the confidence to engage and insist on being able to engage at that level. There was the suspicion that really we might be in opposition. You know, we might get something which would mean they didn't get anything, or you know, or that states would try to play us off against the NGOs, which was a very real possibility, and kind of that, you know, was tried once or twice, but as we went through the process, I think the NGOs increasingly came to see that actually we were also helping to open doors for them. As people have told me all last week, from the High Commissioner and beyond, and a number of ambassadors, the only people who came out of the Human Rights Council process with anything were the national human rights institutions. And you know, so I was pleased that you know, my old trade union organising skills seem to be totally lost. I'd have to say that a lot of it, I mean, it was down to our members engaging, I mean, prepared to engage. It was down to us putting the effort in, but it was also down to the extraordinary relationships that Katerina Rose developed. And I mean, a number of ambassadors said to me, including the Americans last week, of course, Katerina tells us things that we should know, but we haven't picked up ourselves. So, you know, and they've got a whole department focusing on the Human Rights Council. So it was invaluable having somebody on the ground, and who could then keep an eye on what was happening and then contact the National Human Rights Institution that was relevant. One of the gains that we made that ultimately will benefit NGOs, although it'll take a time, is that we were the ones who put into the process that we should be able to make video statements to the Human Rights Council. The impact of having up on the screen the chair of the Indonesian Human Rights Commission speaking about special procedures report directly, you know, so you can, from the ground, or who, you know, is just so much more powerful. And we got that. You know, that's been agreed. They're now just got to work out the modalities, as it were, in the UN speak. You know, there was a lovely story about this, because when we were advocating for this with the NAM ambassadors who weren't keen on it at all, one of the ambassadors said, "But what if there's a point of order?" And I was just going to say something, but before I could respond, one of the other ambassadors said, "Well, we'll just push the pause button." And finally, in respect to treaty bodies, I mean, fundamentally that had been our, you know, very strong focus initially, because obviously the human rights standard, the treaties are so important to strengthening human rights on the ground, to getting them implemented, and the treaty body engagement is prioritised by national human rights institutions. But there were increasingly questions, I mean, you said from NGOs, but, you know, from our members as well, about, you know, the reporting burden, not only on them, but also, particularly in small and poor countries, on them. And, I mean, so what our interest here was in seeing, you know, in actually engaging in the discussion that's going on about how to harmonise, perhaps, or, you know, improve the treaty body system so that it can be more user-friendly. And I think there's two elements. I mean, one, I think there's just now that we've got 9 fundamental human rights treaties and another one being developed, you know, and you just get so proliferation of committees, each with their own rules, their procedure, ways of doing things, no more money coming in, but funding alone won't change it, because for national institutions, it's you know, they cannot simply become, you know, sort of reporting fodder for the treaty bodies. And the treaty bodies, it seemed to us, had kind of, in a sense, forgotten that they really aren't the centre of the world. You know, they have a very important role to play, but what happens in Geneva and New York is not the most important thing, and that they need to adjust their approaches, you know, so to people around the world. And we, national human rights institutions, came together to debate and discuss what would be useful we can leave you a copy of the Marrakesh Declaration, which pretty much summarises, you know, our views about that, which includes that there should be... Oh, right, okay. So you can read it, because I looked at it again last night and actually thought, actually, it's pretty good. And the other plea that we made is that for serious consideration for taking the treaty body meetings away from Geneva and New York, out into the regional, you know, to Bangkok, to Nairobi, to, I forget where in the Americas, you know, where the UN's got all the facilities, because then you would get journalists from the region who could afford to sit in, you'd get more officials participating. It would be part of really, you know, taking the human rights standards and the country examinations, you know, out into the community where they should be. So thank you very much.
Right, the floor is open for any questions, comments.
I just think it's not concrete yet, and out of reading this, I couldn't conclude that it is certain. I read some statements of delegations, and definitely southern delegations were not very happy about video conferencing or in general the use of new technologies, because they said, okay, this will even more make a difference between Western states, which will easily be able to use these new technologies, while we in the South, we won't even be capable of using these technologies.
Well, let me say, first of all, in fact, they've used video conferencing for the first time already, and it was with a special procedure mandate holder who happens to be Cuban. Apparently the Cubans, you know, got very agitated about it. They'd hold it as their special procedure, so they should have known about it. But, you know, it was a really good experience. I agree that video conferencing, I think, is a bit of a challenge because of time differences and so on. But video statements are a really cheap, easy way of doing things. I think the argument about it widening the gap is simply, you know, not true, because the biggest gap is the expense of flying into and, you know, and living in Geneva. Let me tell you something about UN language, because I entirely sympathise. I think, you know, when you read UN language, when I first used to go to the ILO as a workers' delegate, I thought, this is pathetic. Nobody says anything of substance or significance. You know, there's no emotion here. I think we should try to use as plain a language as possible. But let me assure you that the decision that was made is that there will be use of technology, there will be video statements, and we will make sure that we're bringing them forward so that they're forced to sort out modalities.
We had a lot of discussions on these video statements, and that made many delegations, especially from the NAM, were very, very reluctant on accepting this. But the argument was really that it could really help, you know, also developing states, and also be applicable to state delegation. I mean, it never
small island states, for example.
It never replaces someone coming to Geneva, but it still can ease. And here again, you would have the impact of not having an ambassador or a representative in Geneva deliver a statement, but perhaps even have from a higher official who wouldn't otherwise have been able to come to Geneva, but who would be able now to deliver through video statements. You know, discussing this with the Office of the High Commissioner as well, to make sure that you can have the greatest outreach to the people on the ground.
The Council replaced the Human Rights Commission in 2006, and the reason was that allegedly the Commission was so bad, it was so politicized, etc., that one would need a different body in order to improve the situation. Now, in terms of politicization and selectivity, I think that the Council today is much worse. But that is changing the Council from within, from the membership, but the official Human Rights Council review did not produce anything. But so far it worked well, that in the way that every government was producing a report on time, And then it depends, of course, on the country concerned. The peer review is not the best instrument because states are not the best ones to assess whether or not human rights are violated in a country or not, or to what extent. So usually we moved beyond that already in the 1970s by establishing independent treaty monitoring bodies that examined state reports.
Big sort of monitoring. Monitoring is a nice word, but when you get into the field, of course, the issue is monitoring according to which methodology, which standards. Let's say we in Germany would have no idea how to monitor, I would say, the German health system according to human rights standards. What should you do? You have statistics, okay. But imagine, just to give 2 examples, poverty. I remember Asia Pacific National Human Rights Institution are very interested in the issue of poverty and human rights. So what does it mean, monitoring your own country in terms of human rights? And another issue is obviously prevention of torture, where there's quite some experience. But what does it mean for 1 year to monitor your own country? A lot of people come with high expectations towards them. You are going to monitor the national situation, are being able to monitor the national situation. I'm a bit concerned that these are very high expectations, but when it comes to a relatively small organization with limited resources, the issue is who does what is and what are the needs in terms of capacity building training, what are the possibilities for exchange. But finally, someone must do the work.
Absolutely. During my term as ICC chair, I have constantly said to people, most of us are very modestly resourced, and there has to be realism about what you can expect. And particularly I say that to officials in the United Nations and to academics who have hugely unrealistic ideas about what national institutions should be delivering. But having said that, I do think national institutions have an important monitoring role, and the starting point in my experience in terms of it being done effectively is first of all that national institutions can't monitor everything. And so you have to have a basis for systematically identifying priorities and being able to, say, look, we can do this and this, and that means we're not doing that and that. But through the process of selecting priorities, engagement, civil society, government, all of that, it's a transparent process, and you can justify your priorities. From thinking that if you had the legal framework right, that was evidence that you're meeting the human rights standards, to actually what are the outcomes for ordinary people day to day. And there I think the point you've made about the development of indicators is critical. Some institutions, for example, the UK Equality and Human Rights Commission has got a project on key human rights indicators that they're quite a long way down the track, I think. The Canadian Commission has done a very interesting program on indicators about work, and equality and human rights at work. And I know at a practical level, in terms of the New Zealand Human Rights Commission, we're in the process of developing a framework of indicators for equality or equal opportunities in relation to employment. We've just been through the process and we've just refined it down to sort of 20 key indicators that we're going to be publishing shortly. With respect to torture, in fact, we've got standards which we can give you and indicators. I mean, we would love it if someone had come up with indicators across the board that we could just pick up and use, but they haven't yet. And so we're just drawing on what other people are doing and hopefully sharing the experience. And what I said to the working group of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights yesterday was, please would they ask the government not what have you done, but what have you done that's been successful in reducing inequalities or reducing poverty, and where have you not been successful?
This is a field where we really need researchers to get working, because none of us have the time to do it. So this can only be done by cooperation of researchers who have the brains and the time and the patience to sit together and work on it. So there are many different kinds of monitoring. There's what you've been doing, going around to inspect prisons, that is monitoring the situation on the ground in a prison or a mental institution. That's one kind of monitoring. And then there's our monitoring role of the overall human rights issue. But then I think just finally as a warning, so I think we should take it up with the ICC, and I think that the German and Danish institutes are basically the only institutions that have research capacity in our institutions, I think. So I think we could be instrumental in developing international research programs exactly on this. And one of I think the key issues of socio-economic rights is that they do not have an end target. There is no objectively defined indicator of poverty. The government and states should dedicate themselves to reaching a target, and then they set the target, and then you monitor the progress. And we can't leave that to outside experts, legal or international or non-political experts. For instance, in Denmark, for example, 20% of children leave school after ninth grade without the ability to read and understand and reproduce what's written in the newspaper. So 20% are basically unable to take any kind of skilled education after that.
I know three more, but I think we should not use the whole time for an indicated discussion. I think that is for a seminar of 5 days, and there's so much actually that has been done on this already. So, but after this,
right. Yes. The importance of the network, the importance of the fact that we have national human rights institutions, you know, accredited in 67 countries and more, who are closely involved. Clearly, national institutions have a major responsibility in actually promoting and protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, and so we engaged with that resolution both to make that explicit, to acknowledge our responsibilities, but also to make it clear within the resolution what really matters is what happens, you know, back at home, and that requires a whole lot of other things which we are doing at the moment with respect to Indigenous peoples' rights. Assisting NHRIs to engage, individual NHRIs to engage, is the key role that you know tops everything else.
and if you take all that together, I think it's a good basis for assessing the situation in a particular country. The conduct of the Universal Periodic Review is, of course, restricted to states, and the state that is to be assessed then has the right to accept recommendations or not. And in certain countries, if I take for instance China or Cuba, it was just becoming ridiculous because all the friends of China were speaking and the others missed the deadline for inscribing to the speakers list. So you had all those countries that saying China is the big champion in human rights and everything is fine. I mean, that is then making a whole peer review ridiculous. But again, there we see a certain improvement because of the review, so I hope that in the future all states and also non-governmental organizations that wish to speak will be able to actually register on the speakers list. If you are elected into the Human Rights Council, you should forget about your individual state interests and agendas and try to become part of a collective system that is going to prevent the worst human rights violations and improve the situation in general. And I think that is something states need to change in their perception. The moment it's just block voting and everything is political, and I think we have to try to overcome that with a good spirit from both sides. I'm not only blaming the South, I'm blaming it's the European Union who is first already always negotiating a common position, and then this takes such a long time that there's no flexibility anymore for any kind of compromises. So that's, the EU is as much a bloc as the Organization of the Islamic Conference.
What do we do here?